sisters and brothers. Diri Mukaro Aguevana, Borikin Taino Daka. My name's Roberto Mukaro Borrero. I'm a Taino indigenous person representing United Confederation of Taino People, and I'm very honored to be uh, moderating this panel today, this discussion. Bienvenidos a todos. Mi nombre es Roberto Mucaro Borrero. Soy del pueblo taíno, representando a la Confederación Unida del Pueblo Taíno. Pues el papel de moderador para el diálogo hoy. Y primero voy a compartir algunas instrucciones para la función de interpretación de Zoom, primero en inglés y después en español. Okay, right before we begin our session, I just want to quickly go over our Zoom interpretation feature for those who are signing in to our IITC webinar today for the first time. What you need to do, and I'm going to share my screen and bring up some instructions so that you could just follow along. Okay. All right, if you look at the screen here, you'll see that it's the first thing you need to do is locate the Zoom interpretation icon, and that's located at the bottom right of your screen. You see a little globe here, and then you want to click on that. What you'll do next is you'll find the English. After you click on that globe, you'll find the English. Select that if you're speaking English, and then you'll want to select mute original audio, which is very important because if you don't mute the original audio, you'll hear both languages at the same time. Again, select English and then mute original audio. If you have questions or comments throughout the presentation and when we open up for dialogue, you can send those comments and put them in the chat feature. And you'll see again at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat icon, and that's where you'll be able to send your questions in. Now I'll just revert very quickly into Spanish to go over the instructions one more time. Ahora voy a compartir las instrucciones para la función de interpretación de la plataforma de Zoom. Primero, localice el icono de interpretación. Está en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla. Aquí es una imagen, puede ver un globito. Seleccione ese globito y después, y aquí, seleccione español, Spanish. Después de eso, seleccione Mute Original Audio, que quiere decir apaga el audio original, y esto es muy importante, si no vas a escuchar los dos idiomas en el mismo vez. Si hay comentarios o preguntas, puede usar el icono de chat, está también aquí, tú puedes ver la imagen donde está. Ahora voy a volver en inglés otra vez porque tenemos la interpretación ahora. All right, I'm going to stop my screen share. And we'll come back. Again, I just want to say welcome to everyone to our IITC webinar, looking ahead to life after COVID. Today is our 8th and final presentation in this series. And we're very honored today to have our featured speaker. But I will introduce right now Andrea Carman, who's the executive director of the International Indian Treaty Council. She's going to provide an introduction and just let you know a little bit about what we're going to hear today. Andrea, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Joque Tesia, Roberto, and very thankful to everybody who's listening in today to this last webinar in International Indian Treaty Council's series focusing on looking ahead to life after COVID. What have we learned? What should we keep and strengthen? What do we need to change or let go of? It's always been in our spiritual teachings, at least for my Yaqui Nation, that when big events happen, either good or bad things happen to us, the stronger the experience, the more there is for us to reflect on what we need to learn. and sometimes what we need to change and do differently moving forward. Um, this is not to say that the COVID pandemic is over and done with. I know in many of our communities, including my own, there's still a very significant impact. Without sounding too dramatic, we're burying a lot of people here on our reservation, and also being hit within our nation in Rio Yaqui in northern Mexico as well. And many indigenous communities are just beginning to experience a increased impact. Some, I'm happy to say, have passed through with whatever they experienced, but we felt, of course, the trauma that all of us are feeling, the human rights violations that are occurring, and also we've highlighted in past webinars the human rights violations that are taking place, that governments and corporations are pushing on our communities, using COVID as an excuse to suspend processes of consent, protection for environment and cultural rights. That's certainly happening here with the construction of the border wall just down the road on the Tonotam sacred sites. We also felt it was important for us to collectively look forward. We've had the views of spiritual leaders and elders talking about prophecies that exist, not just about what might happen like this if we continue to abuse as a collective human species our natural world, but also what we need to do next. We've heard from our next generation leaders who are coming to the forefront of the work in our movement and our communities. What are they thinking? And last week we had a very amazing webinar hearing the views on this topic of Indigenous youth from various regions, from Africa, Caribbean, Latin America, and North America. So we've been able to really hear the thoughts of Indigenous peoples from all of the regions, from all different roles and perspectives. And we continue to also offer our thoughts and prayers to those that are struggling with this illness. I understand what it's like. Myself and three generations of my family went through having COVID back in June, and luckily, I can say we're all doing really well now. But many families are not so lucky. Many of our Indigenous peoples are not so lucky. As you all know, we lost one of our board members at the very end of August, Mariano Milano. You stay safe and strong, and that we can come through this together, as we have with so many experiences in our collective past, including other pandemics that we suffered. So with that, and those thoughts, an introduction to say, okay, let's move forward. What do we need to do? I want to introduce our guest speaker, Francisco Kalitzai. Many of us know him for many years as Pancho. He's been in many important roles in the Indigenous movement globally at the United Nations, for International and Treaty Council as our past board president, and continuing his organization to be an affiliate, CEPRODI, of the ITC. And as we all know, in May of this year, he was honored with being selected to carry on the next period of work as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And when he came into this work with many plans and many considerations expressed by Indigenous peoples to address, he found himself in the middle of this COVID epidemic. also his first study for the United Nations, based on a questionnaire that many Indigenous peoples, as well as states and organizations, responded to, was on the impacts of COVID on Indigenous peoples. He gave a short summary to the UN Human Rights Council a couple of weeks ago, but the report in its entirety will be presented to the United Nations General Assembly this month. So we are getting a preview, very special preview of some of his conclusions and recommendations, especially like looking forward. What do we need from the states? What do we need from each other? What do we need from our own peoples and nations in order to survive and thrive as we move forward through this experience into a better future? So with that, I would like to introduce my longtime very good friend and our esteemed United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Francisco Kalitzai from the Cachiquel Mayan peoples. And with that, I turn the floor over to Pancho. Thank you so much. There will be a chance to ask questions at the end. As Roberto said, for those just joining, write your questions in the chat and we will have plenty of time for dialogue after his presentation. Thank you. Jokwe.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Pancho first introduced himself in his Mayan language, and we're now beginning Spanish to English interpreting. Good afternoon, everyone. Brothers and sisters, I would first like to offer an homage to all of our brothers and sisters who have transitioned on to the spiritual world because of this pandemic that has affected all of humanity and is creating economic problems, problems of survival for our peoples. Our peoples are the most deeply affected by this right now. And I want to first of all thank the International Indian Treaty Council for this series of seminars or virtual meetings that they've been holding, because I think it's important to emphasize this work to show what has been going on with our brothers and sisters. And I would like to begin specifically by saying, as Andrea mentioned, I received my mandate in the beginning of May of this year, when the pandemic had already been declared. COVID-19 had already been declared to be a pandemic that was affecting the entire world. By that date, if I remember correctly, we were already talking about perhaps 11 million people, or probably more, infected, causing the deaths of almost 500,000 people at that time. It was a very worrisome situation. And also, I was hearing the voices of my brothers and sisters saying that we should conduct a study about the impact that COVID-19 was having at that time. And I want to tell you and mention that next year, and not in the General Assembly, but in the Human Rights Council, I will be issuing a study about the impacts that COVID-19 has had on Indigenous peoples. And the reason I say that is because if we see now that Indigenous peoples have not only suffered the impacts of COVID-19, but also we look at how states and private companies have taken advantage of the international agencies to continue on with their combat uh, uh, in indigenous territories, especially with regard to extractive industries now under the so-called economic recovery under the world's economic model. They have attempted to establish this in a world all over the world in fundamental violation of the right to free, prior, and informed consent, according to the Declaration. And also in the states, in many states, or I think you could say in all states, there are environmental laws that exist. An environmental law that requires extractive industry companies to carry out environmental impact studies. They want to now avoid the impact studies, the environmental impact studies, in favor of economic recovery to promote, as they say, economic recovery, so that it will be faster than predicted if they can skip these steps. This is something that is very important, and it's worth repeating that we should be very concerned not just about the pandemic, but about state policies and practices of private companies. In this same sense, we can also say that there is no population in the world that has not been affected in some way by these restrictions and the measures that have been implemented to fight the pandemic. And I must say that in many ways, I support these measures because the measures are necessary in order to prevent contagion and infection of peoples. But when these measures violate indigenous peoples' rights, this is something we must look at and analyze, because the measures, especially with regard to the exceptional laws that have been passed, they violate the rights of the free movement of indigenous peoples, especially of those cross-border indigenous peoples who have historically had the custom of crossing these state borders without any restrictions, because states have recognized that right. Now, because of these special measures, that right has been made more difficult. For example, the Yaquis have a very hard experience related to this situation. Also, with indigenous peoples in Africa, this is the case with them, especially for those indigenous peoples who practice shepherding and grazing. This is their pastoral life that they have practiced with their flocks, traditionally moving from one place to another and one country to another, and states have prohibited indigenous peoples from continuing that tradition since the pandemic began. And this is a very difficult situation. And
when I decided to take on this study, it was quite difficult to implement this study because of the fact that I didn't know how many people or how many institutions would respond. It was really incredible, the response that I had, because I received between 150 and 170 responses from indigenous peoples, their organizations, from the states, and also from civil society and NGOs. There were reports that were quite detailed, and there was really a lot of alarming information that COVID-19 had in, on the Indigenous peoples communities. But there were also reports that were also gave me a lot of hope. And I was really surprised by something that I saw. I was talking to a Kuna sister last week, and she was actually confirming what was said in this one report and what I was thinking about since the beginning. And allow me to say to you that one of the one of the reports that I'm going to launch for the next year to prepare and present to the General Assembly is the situation of Indigenous peoples in urban areas. As anthropologists say, I want to demystify it, that the majority of Indigenous
I'm
peoples,
sorry. I'm sorry. Can
uh,
we just hold off a minute? We seem to have some issue where
hay
the
algún problema.
interpretation is filtering over into the Spanish. I'm sorry to
Lo siento
interrupt you,
mucho. No lo quiero
but
interrumpir. Oh,
just for the interpreters, please make sure that we're in the right channels. And for everyone else who's tuning in,
y
please
todos
make sure
los demás.
that you have selected your proper language using the interpretation icon. I have posted those instructions a number of times in the chat. And make sure that you mute the original audio. If you're not muting the original audio, you will hear both the English and Spanish at the same time. I apologize. Uh, Special Rapporteur, please continue.
So I was saying that I want to demystify that situation where it, they think that Indigenous peoples only live in rural areas, and that's one of the reports that I'm going to give to the General Assembly the next year. And the situation is quite delicate in the rural areas or Indigenous peoples, and in the urban area, it's even more complicated because in one way or another, same security measures for health measures, it makes it impossible for Indigenous peoples that live in the urban areas cannot communicate with the rural areas. It doesn't matter where they live, rural or urban area, they still maintain this social connection among the communities. So that's why I want to say that I am against these famous measures that talk about social distancing, because what they want to do is to even divide our communities even more. And what I think is that it's important to have physical distancing, but not social distancing, because for social distancing, it has really caused us a lot of damages. It has created a lot of differences in our societies. It has caused the difference of social classes and racial discrimination and racism. That's what social distancing has caused. But it's important to have physical distancing, that's true, but not with those people that we have a family relationship. Not at all in the family relationship of Indigenous peoples. We can't have that kind of social distancing. So the compilation of these reports, and when I read them, what I wanted to say before Roberto talked about this technical problem that we had, I spoke to a friend of ours from last week, and she was confirming what I saw in the reports. Some of the Indigenous peoples that live in the urban areas returned to their communities, and they had already lost the tradition, the customs of producing their own food. They returned to the communities, and then they were forced to relearn how to produce their own traditional foods. But this isn't just for Indigenous peoples, it's also for non-Indigenous peoples that saw how Indigenous peoples were producing their own foods, and they also started to produce their own food. And I think that's really important to have the inclusive um, attitudes and also to have our own gardens, even if we live in urban areas. I think that's really important. And about COVID-19, I was wondering to myself, how can we focus on this? Because the declaration, although the declaration, it does say that Indigenous peoples, it speaks about the rights that we have to have health services or medical attention. I had to analyze other international instruments. And so if we go to the International Covenant for business practices and social practices, Article 12, it speaks of the right that Indigenous peoples have the right to in the development and the administration of their health programs using their own institutions. In Article 23, the right to their medicines and traditional health practices, and number 24 of the covenant, and 12, uh, sorry, I'm going very fast for the interpreters, and paragraph 2 of Article 12, economic and social rights. It's the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. It says the right to health include necessary measures for the prevention and the treatment of epidemic diseases and have professional assistance and other kinds of assistance. So I had to consider the recommendations of the committees on the economic and social committees and also the committee for the political and international rights, on human rights. There are several recommendations that we find here, and that's what that gave me the legal basis in order to establish and to write the report. So I had to analyze some of the international instruments, regional instruments. Uh, for example, the African Charter on Human Rights, where it says that we have the right to health without any kind of discrimination, and also the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that recognizes the collective right and individual rights of Indigenous peoples to enjoy the highest level of mental, physical, spiritual health and to maintain their own systems of health. So based on this, I started to consider the entire situation that was developing throughout the world. And when I started to receive these reports, it confirmed what I feared, and it is that Indigenous peoples, they were the ones that were at most risk during this time, especially because of the circumstances, the historical circumstances that have kept them outside of the national health services that they should have received. And also the pre-existent health issues that they're facing, the lack of access to medical care, to also the social environmental factors that have been changing because of uh, the disproportionate measures of they've been exploiting the different natural resources throughout the world, and we've been affected by that. And so, if we remember the historical memory of Indigenous peoples, it's been marked by pandemics. For example, we have measles and chickenpox, flu, right? The influenza. These were spread by the colonizers, and many times it was done in a deliberate fashion, and it was it devastated our communities. And of course, when COVID-19 started, then the community started to inform us that the alarming levels of infection that was taking place in the communities, and sometimes it was even having higher rates of death rates in our community from the pandemic, from the virus. And we can mention the Hopi Nation, the Navajo Nation, and in Panama, the Kuna people, and also the groups of indigenous peoples that remain in isolation in the Amazon, because the majority of indigenous peoples have been affected in a, a great way, and the pandemic has really been has had devastating effects in many of our communities. And this, of course, has affected principally in the lack of information, the lack of data that is adequate on how to face these infections, how to deal with them, and not necessarily in just in the official languages, because the needs that indigenous peoples have for them to have this information in their own language is something that cannot be disputed. It is a right that indigenous peoples have to have this information in their own language. This is something that we have seen in the reports that we have received. That would be on the negative end of the spectrum. And even though indigenous peoples have been the ones that have been most affected by COVID-19, they are also ha- the ones that have control of their territories, and they are the ones that practice their autonomy as a way of practicing self-determination. And as indigenous peoples, we have resources in order to face the pandemic. We have things like our style, our lifestyle, our culture, our connection to the land, to the earth. This is a huge source of what is now being called resilience of indigenous peoples. And of course, this also helps us to face the isolation and the lockdowns that we've had to deal with because of this is what the state has required. And of course, resilience can't just be one path for indigenous peoples to say this is going to work for all of indigenous peoples communities. No, each community, indigenous peoples group has developed their own way to establish resilience in their community and to face the pandemic. But there's something that's very important to highlight. It's the support that the community gives to people that have become infected by COVID-19. And one of the first times I had an intervention when we had the first series, I shared with the brothers and sisters that on 2 or 3 occasions, different brothers and sisters were sharing with me, and they were saying that it was much better that people that had the infected remain in the community, and of course, taken the necessary health cautions because in the community and they had much more moral and spiritual support. So if they were infected, it was better for them to remain in the communities. Because if they were to leave the community and go to hospitals, they would be in isolation. And generally speaking, COVID-19 attacks when they are isolated, and it is deadly. I was being told that in the community, it had been proven that having this community solidarity, but also the traditional medicines from indigenous peoples communities, together with the modern medicine, they were able to get better. There was one of our indigenous brothers who, when he woke up, he said, if they had taken me to the hospital, I'm certain that I would have not continued living because being sick with with the fever that I had, maybe I wasn't even awake, is what he was saying, but I felt the presence of my brothers and sisters, of my mother, my grandmother, and I felt how they were giving me the tea and taking care of me while I was in the community. What I want to share with you is that
That this is the what sociologists call the indigenous community values are held out as one of the most important advantages to fight COVID-19. Did you get
Jimmy ahora tiene el micrófono. Sí, sí.
and what was regrettable in most of the reports from indigenous peoples is that the states did not take indigenous peoples into account in fighting COVID and much less in forming COVID-19 policies, uh, less even so, even for setting post COVID-19 policies. And this is something that is very regrettable. And of course, the indigenous communities themselves that we can mention, many of them in El Salvador and Australia, New Zealand, Bolivia, just to mention a few, these communities started to implement some of their own anti-COVID-19 containment policies. And there were many responses from the reports that I began to receive. And this historically has been with regard to the need that indigenous peoples have historically had to quickly overcome the crises they face in many different occasions throughout history regarding health crises and pandemics and diseases. And indeed, during this pandemic, they have had to stand up for themselves and without the support of the states. And this, one of the most important things has been the policies for isolation without the support of states, that indigenous peoples, communities and organizations have promoted this themselves. In Australia, the regional clinic was opened in Tobwonga, Queensland, directed by Aboriginal people. The clinic provided a place that was culturally safe to receive COVID-19 testing and treatment, and the clinic also treated other non-Indigenous people who were vulnerable. And this is also a point that we should mention. For example, in the United States, in the Pahoke communities in New Mexico, they have set up hotel rooms and their casinos to receive people, both of their tribe and people from all over the state who need to be in a quarantine. And all over, Indigenous peoples have set up their own community watch programs and their own coordination centers in each community to daily keep track of the number of infections. In India, many Indigenous communities have set up ecological quarantine centers with no government support whatsoever. These centers have been used for a 14-day period for repatriation and for those who leave the cities and come back to villages. We can talk a lot about these community containment measures, but I also want to talk about the conclusions and also some of the recommendations in the report that the Special Rapporteur's office is making regarding COVID-19 and Indigenous peoples. But I don't want to forget about also the situation that COVID-19 is causing. First of all, with regard to the attacks and violations of the rights of our earth and the attacks against human rights defenders that are occurring in relation to COVID-19, because these states are taking advantage of the containment measures and the anti-COVID-19 measures to attack human rights defenders. And this has increased. The level of attacks has increased at an alarming rate against Indigenous peoples during the pandemic. Some states have taken advantage of this situation to increase the police and military presence in the regions and in the lands and territories of Indigenous peoples as they see and give the mission of COVID-19 as a national security issue, and they are putting a national security health issue that they're calling an emergency. But this is a health emergency. It's not a national security emergency. And so this is of great concern for the Office of the Special Rapporteur. So one of the conclusions that the Office of the Special Rapporteur has reached is that the pandemic has made clear the existing deficiencies in our health system, and it has exposed these weaknesses in the public health system and the social security system, and it has left Indigenous peoples behind, and it has aggravated the great range of systemic rights violations that Indigenous peoples face as the world prepares strategies to mitigate with the social economic impact of the confinement measures. Indigenous people's rights should be at the center of these policies, and that way of fighting COVID-19, human rights and Indigenous people's rights must be a fundamental part of the strategy for fighting COVID-19 in the future, without any discrimination. And with regard to the situation facing elderly Indigenous people, people with disabilities, Indigenous people with disabilities, women and children, uh, and those of different sexual orientations. All of this must also be taken into account in the Indigenous communities. Of course, the Indigenous Peoples Collective right to health includes, of course, our right to have our own healthcare systems. Many Indigenous peoples depend on fragile ecosystems for their survival and subsistence, and these ecosystems have been made more fragile. And this impact has occurred from outside of the communities. So, of course, one of the recommendations is that the special rapporteur encourages Indigenous communities and international organizations to support in a form of solidarity at this emergency time the Indigenous communities that have not received support. This includes carrying out more testing, more personal protective equipment, treatment that is sufficient treatment and culturally appropriate treatment, and also measures related to health and water and social protection. With regard to water, as you know much better than anyone else, many Indigenous peoples must walk for hours to obtain that fundamental liquid of life. So, and one of the most important necessary measures in life and for our healthcare in this situation is to wash our hands with soap. And so it is very difficult in some conditions to do that. And I have seen photos from UNICEF showing water brought to Indigenous communities in Africa so that they can wash their hands, and they put up gallons of water at the entrance and the exits to the communities. But the children, when they see that water, they don't wash with it, they don't wash their hands, they drink that water because they need water to drink, and they don't see that water for washing their hands. So this is also a great concern, that something that human beings have created at this point in history, that water is now a commodity, a commercial commodity, rather than something fundamental for sustenance of life. So with regard to our recommendations that will be published with, for Indigenous people's rights in light of the pandemic, we recommend a support group, an international support group be formed for Indigenous peoples. The Office of the Special Rapporteur also highlights and points out recommendations to states, to organizations, to Indigenous communities, to donors, to the international community, the UN organizations and international companies, that as one of they set important policies to fight COVID-19 and take into account, first of all, health interests and not financial interests. Financial interests can be recovered. Lives cannot be recovered. We have a great need for organization, both for state and Indigenous authorities and the health systems. And the Office of the Special Rapporteur believes that it's necessary to create contingency plans. Planning to avoid further contamination from this pandemic and distribution of the pandemic. Some of the things that could be managed in an independent way, and that also could require support from government and non-governmental institutions with the support of Indigenous peoples. And we also suggest measures to support those who are sick in Indigenous communities with the help of the counterparts on local and regional governments. One of the most clear things we see with regard to COVID-19 is that many authorities and governments and leaders are saying that we must not be afraid of COVID, that it's just like a flu. And while it may be true that the flu kills many more people than COVID-19, but the flu is does not infect people in the same way that COVID-19 infects people. As according to the studies I've been reading and what I've learned, COVID-19 is a disease that we would not wish on anyone. I would not wish this disease even on my worst enemy. You cannot know the pain, the suffering that people go through day to day, that they feel in their entire body when they have COVID-19 and their body needs to breathe and they don't have the ability to do it. This is the information that must be distributed, not to alarm the population, but in order for the population to be clear on this issue and to take the appropriate measures with regard to this emergency situation we're facing. So I invite and encourage Indigenous communities to share information with local, state, and national, regional governments and with international organizations with regard to health and human rights, and to share this information as long as these parties respect Indigenous people's right to control their own information. States should update their plans and contingency measures to face the pandemic. And these measures should include specific economic measures directed towards Indigenous peoples, specifically, such as a directory with contact information for authorities and leaders in urban centers. States also, for example, in urban centers should focus on Indigenous peoples with general responses. I have several recommendations regarding this and regarding the prevention measures and to prevent infections, the confinement and isolation measures. Also, it's necessary to ask states to make the, their best efforts to protect human rights defenders and to respect the right to free expression and press freedom. It is true that we have this need for economic and social recovery, but the economic and social recovery national plans that are being developed should not be at the cost and sacrifice of Indigenous peoples, especially with regard to the harm done in the territories and lands of Indigenous peoples, which are a reserve of great natural resources. And this should not be used as a pretext to extract those resources from Indigenous peoples in order to, according to what they say, make the economies function and recover again. Roberto, I would like to conclude my statements here and open the floor so we have some time for interactive dialogue. I know our brothers and sisters that have joined us, they're listening, they're 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 seeing us, and as Andrea was saying in the beginning, this is a dialogue and it is a preview of the report that I will present on Monday at 3 p.m. New York time for the General Assembly in California. That will be 12 p.m. It'll be 2 p.m. in Guatemala time. And I would just like to thank IITC and everyone. Thank you for organizing this virtual meeting. Thank you all for joining us. And I would now like to receive your comments and questions. Thank you very much, Roberto.
Ahom, Atiao. Thank you, brother, for that really intensive summary. We really appreciate the detail that you put into sharing with us, and also to providing those recommendations, at least that summary of recommendations. I'm sure everyone looks forward to getting more information about the report after it's presented. But as our esteemed panelist has stated, we want to open up the floor to some dialogue. There has been some questions coming in, There was a comment. I'll share a comment and then maybe a question. One was about, let's see here. We had from Ty Pelly talking about the advantage that was taken uh, while the local governments were destroying sacred sites that were being defended by our people. But with the quarantine and the restrictions, those defenders were taken away from the site, but yet the government and the agency still continued to destroy the sacred site. So that's one way that they were taken advantage of. Now I have another question that came in, not a comment, but a question here. Um, what measures are taking place in the UN to protect Indigenous human rights defenders during and after COVID-19? Any thoughts there?
The only measures right now are those that are the established measures for the defense of human rights defenders. There are several mechanisms that have been implemented specifically to avoid uh, attacks and repercussions against human rights defenders. We have the urgent measures. We have focal groups, focal points in each of the mechanisms, in each of the treaty bodies, in order to take immediate action at a specific time when they have the appropriate information regarding who it is, what it is that's happening, when there's information about who is attacking human rights defenders uh, and defenders of indigenous peoples. It's very important to collect all of the information so that the treaty bodies and, of course, the specialized mechanisms can take immediate action. I think that not long ago, I think if I'm not mistaken, last week, several special rapporteurs met to put out a press release about what was happening to our Wayu brothers in Colombia with regard to actions that were being taken by a coal mining operation that was contaminating the lands of our Wayu brothers. So there's an example where when we have the adequate information, we can take immediate action. These are the same mechanisms that we've always had, that we have in the UN to present this information that can also be presented to the treaty bodies, such as the Committee Against Racial Discrimination, which has an urgent action mechanism, and or to respond to attacks and reprisals taken against human rights defenders. Also, reports can be made to the Human Rights Committee as well, of course.
Thank you for that. We do have a question or a hand raised from Moko Morris. I'm going to try to switch it so that you can ask your question directly. Just give me a moment here. Okay, Moko Morris, can you hear me? You're muted. Can you unmute yourself? Okay, you're still muted, and it seems that I'm not able to unmute you. So if you can type your question in, that would be helpful. Unfortunately, we're not able to unmute you. So while we're waiting for that, for Moko Morris to type in the question, there was also a comment from Andrea Carman. Andrea, do you want to ask the question outright, or do you want me to read it for you? You have a comment and a question. You have to unmute.
Thanks. Thank you, Pancho, for your summary of your report. And I was really thinking while you were talking about the impact of the isolation that is imposed on Indigenous community members when they have to leave their community to get medical care. And of course, families aren't allowed to come in, traditional healers aren't allowed to come in, the doctors don't even want them to use traditional medicine if they have it. And I think that contributed a lot to the suffering that Mariano went through, mental, spiritual, physical, as well as lack of, the traditional medicines, which are still really strong in Yaqui communities, as you know. I'm wondering, is there a call on states, or have you received any commitment from state governments to provide better medical care in communities? Because part of the problem, there are no hospitals or even really any clinics with, where people can stay in any of our Mexico Yaqui communities. So he had to be taken to the city, and was then, his family couldn't see him or even receive any news from him about his condition, and of course couldn't be with him when he finally passed away. So I think this is a form of almost torture, you could say, mental, spiritual, physical torture. He felt very desperate, we were told, because of that. And the solution seems to be, more medical facilities in Indigenous communities, so that Indigenous peoples can utilize both if need be, and still see their families. I'm wondering if there's proposals for this, or have states made any commitments to provide these services, so that people don't need to go to hospitals outside their land and die alone there.
I'm sorry, Andrea, I didn't hear your question because still mixing Spanish and
Oh
English. Would you
no.
please ask again? I hear you the most, all the background of what was happening with Mariano, but your question I didn't hear.
Oh, it was, are we still experiencing the technical problems of mixing languages? Oh, okay, now it's okay. All right, yes, no, I was asking, have you received any commitments from states, or are you making a recommendation to states that they provide medical facilities in our communities, so that Indigenous peoples that do get sick are able to stay at home or in their home communities, as well as to receive medical attention they may need from, the Western system? It was, I think, contributed to his death that he was taken far away, because there were no clinics or hospitals in our Yaqui communities. He couldn't see his family. He couldn't receive traditional medicine, and was very desperate spiritually and emotionally as well, because of the isolation while he was sick. So it seems like the solution might be there be more facilities in our communities, so people don't need to leave and go far away to hospitals where they're isolated. I'm wondering if you have had any commitments for that from states, or what is the solution?
No, I have not received any commitment from governments or states, but that is some of my recommendations to the states, because that has been some of the requirement or some of the the requirement of indigenous organizations, indigenous peoples, to to allow not only to receive the modern medical treatment, but also to combine with the, indigenous people's medicine. And in some cases, in this moment, I don't remember well, I don't recall where is where a hospital already is allowing that the hospitals can provide indigenous people's medicines to the indigenous patients in the hospital. If I don't recall badly, it's in Chile, in a Mapuche hospital. So I think that they are, but I have not received any commitment from the government. But yes, that is some of the questions and the suggestion of indigenous people organizations.
Thank you for that. We have another question from Mini Dagawan. She asked, can the special rapporteur make an appeal to the funding institutions like the GEF, the GCF, and WB to take into account COVID funding for Indigenous peoples communities, and ask implementing organizations to be mindful of the needs of communities to isolate. This is so as not to go ahead with projects as if there was no pandemic.
Yes, was one of the questions that I was taking here because it's in the chat. And Minnie, thank you very much for your question. In my report, it doesn't mention those three financial institutions. But personally, I will, when I will have the opportunity to reach them or to have a conversation with them, of course, I will say to them, because that is one of the problems that we are seeing, that specifically the World Bank, they are continuing financing those extractive projects. They are financing also the construction of dams. And that is one of the problems that we are facing, not only here, but where you are coming from also, many, there are many problems that they are facing because the so-called emergency is not affecting them. And that's why they are continuing financing those projects. But I will commit with you and also with indigenous people that that will be one of the points that I will discuss with them.
Thank you. We have another question from Amy Wan. She writes that the Trump administration or the United States government continues to cause great environmental destruction and disregard for indigenous peoples' human rights along the southern border. There are several US tribes being affected by this in regards to disturbance of sacred landscapes, ancestral remains, and the right to cross borders. What are some ways that the UN mechanisms can be helpful and supportive of tribes fighting those violations?
Pardon, I'm sorry for this, but this question is I can try to answer together with the question that TZAY was put it also, and you read it in the beginning, Roberto. Unfortunately, what we have to say is that as a special rapporteur, I can be in communication with the state representative if I receive not a formal communication to the rapporteur, but at least a letter mentioning all these kind of issues that is taking place. Because then I can write to the state telling them that I have received information and that what we need is to more information from that activities, but also to stop those activities. The other way is also that you have to send an urgent action to the treaty bodies, especially to the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And the only thing is that you have to remember that those mechanisms take time to reach a consensus, to send a communication to a state. And I know that it's very urgent, but the response of the UN mechanism is going to be probably 3-6 months from the time that you present the communication. Also, you can go to the OES mechanism, and it's going to be almost the same, 6 months, 1 year, that is going to take to have one responses from those institutions. What we have to do is just to directly, we have to write as an indigenous people to the state, to the government, and to get more people who are willing to sign together with indigenous people to protest and to ask also to stop that kind of or of behaving of the state, and letting know them that they are violating the human right of indigenous peoples. That can be my suggestion, but the thing is that I cannot tell you that it's going to be a immediate response from United Nations mechanism. For me, it's going to take at least 2, 3, 4 weeks to answer a request such as yours.
Thank you. It seems that Minnie would like to follow up comment on the financing institutions. Let's see if we can have her do that directly. Okay, Minnie, can you, there you go, you're
Yes.
unmuted, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, Pancho, for that response. I just wanted to follow up because we are in discussions with some of the funding institutions, but always the limitation is that they are working in the so-called developing countries. And I was just listening to Andrea. In this time of the pandemic, the virus is not selecting developing countries over developed countries. And our brothers and sisters, wherever they are being affected by the virus. So if there can be an appeal that support can be afforded to all indigenous peoples and not based on geographical locations, I think if it comes from the Special Rapporteur's office, they can hear this loudly and clearly, and if there can be a support also from the indigenous peoples, that would also be welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Minnie.
Thank you, Minnie. Thank you, Minnie. I think that I will be in touch with you just to discuss this issue, and I will try to do my best and to have that communication with them.
All right. I'm just taking a look, and we have some time for some more questions. There was a request by Cliff Summers to ask a question and make a comment. Cliff, if you could just try to keep it concise. I will try to add you now here so that you can ask your question. Cliff, can you unmute yourself? Please try again, Cliff, to unmute yourself. It's I'm not able to do it. Okay,
Yeah.
You have the floor.
I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. First of all, thank you for this opportunity to both hear some of the ideas of going forward about what we can do after COVID. I guess my question happens to do with the UN mechanism as well. In the dismantling of apartheid, for example, in the early 90s, it happened because there was economic sanctions made against South Africa. It started in the UN Security Council, and then it became a whole initiative of the General Assembly. And at some point, the government of South Africa was required to dismantle apartheid because it was a racist law. And it was well known, and it's well known now, that the model to create apartheid was the Indian Act in Canada, and I'm sure the Indian Act in the United States as well. And so when the government of South Africa was made to dismantle apartheid because of it being a racist law, I expected that the focus would then turn towards Canada to dismantle the Indian Act, because that was the model for creating this racist law. And when that didn't happen, I was, I guess, dismayed by that, to put it mildly. But we've had, in 2015, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that completed its work here in Canada. And last year, we had the conclusion of the National Inquiry against missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. And both of those reports, Canada was cited by the TRC, by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for cultural genocide against Indigenous people in Canada. And more specifically, the National Inquiry cited Canada for genocide against Indigenous women and girls. And so I guess earlier in the year, in January, I'm sure the whole world probably witnessed the attacks by industry, and certainly by the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, against the Wet'suwet'en Nation, because they were defending their jurisdiction, they were defending their land from encroachment by the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And at the time, I wrote a letter to the United Nations Special Rapporteur regarding human rights, and my concern was to invite the United Nations to come to Canada to help to defend the rights of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, because of being attacked by the RCMP, and there was no or little attempt by the government, federally or even provincially, to intervene.
Cliff, it's kind of a long commentary, and I want to make sure that we get to the question. Could you get to the question, because we also have others that want to take the floor.
Okay. Well, I guess that's basically the comments that I wanted to make, and I don't know how to condense it into a question. I guess, you know, is there going to be an opportunity for Indigenous people to follow up and you know, develop mechanisms going forward to help to intervene on these issues of genocide and attacks by either police? I mean, it's happening here, but it's also happening against other Indigenous people in other parts of the world. And so I don't know what, I'll just leave it at that.
All right, thank you very much, Cliff.
Okay.
Do you want to respond, Pancho?
No, just to say thank you very much, Cliff, for your comment, and just to not to like like an answer, just to say that if I don't recall badly, there is a communication to the Canadian government about the pipeline. It's not only by the special procedure, but also from at least the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has been done communication to the Canadian government. Only that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you can be in touch with the special rapporteur through the website, and there is an email that is indigenous at ohchr.org. Again, indigenous at ohchr.org. We do have another question that came in, and let's see if I could. This is from, if you take a look there, it's from Zulma Villa. And what she's asking here is a situation in Peru. So there's a concern with this reactivation of the economy. Again, because in addition to not having a stoppage of the extractive industries or activities within indigenous territories, it seems that the state is also taking advantage to use internal regulations to legalize the dispossession of territories, such as forest concessions within indigenous territories in the Amazon, for example, or mining concessions in the Andean zone. So Zulma is noting here that it would be important to have a recommendation for states to refrain from continuing to allow third parties to enter indigenous territories, even if they're not demarcated or recognized in that way. Do you wish to comment?
Muchas gracias, Zulma. Ya había tomado en cuenta, lo tenía
Thank you very
subrayado
much,
aquí
Zulma.
en los
I had taken that into
mensajes
account already and seen that
¿cómo
in
se llama?
the
Del chat que
chat
tenemos.
messages we have here. I saw your comment. And this is something that is not only happening in Peru, but it is also happening in many other places. And it is being done both legally and illegally. They're using laws, and sometimes they're they are avoiding laws and ignoring laws, and the states are using, unfortunately, this same mentality that territory that is not registered in the name of any certain person is considered terra nullius. In other words, the state has this authority to give concessions or licenses for exploiting natural resources on those lands. And I think we must stress that although all lands on the Abya continent are truly indigenous lands, but unfortunately, it is on the indigenous people to prove that these are indigenous lands. However, if I recall correctly, there is a recommendation made to states to avoid authorizing these actions and that do not meet international standards for the defense of the rights of indigenous peoples, and as they continue these extractive operations. I have also said many times in previous occasions, and I've said this here in our virtual IITC conferences, that the states have a high responsibility and obligation to meet international standards for respect and defense of human rights of indigenous peoples, principally the right to free, prior, and informed consent and to obtain consent. So I believe this is something we must take into account And yes, it is included in my recommendations. Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you so much. That will be the last question or comment that we have time for today. I want to thank the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Francisco CALI, for taking the time to be with us all today and to present aspects of his report and recommendations, and also take time to comment on comments that some of our attendees have made, and also try to the best of his ability to answer some of the questions that were posed. Many of these were quite complex, and we're just thankful for his expertise that he's able to provide some guidance. I want to also thank all of our behind the scenes persons who help us get these webinars going. Chris Honani, Amy Juan, and also our interpreters, Rebecca Knight and Jimmy Clark, for being here and assisting us in this way throughout our webinar series, this one and our previous one, and we hope during our next series as well. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce Andrea Carman once again, who will just tell us a little bit about the next upcoming series that IITC plans to host in the coming months. And also, I'm sure that she would like to thank Francisco CALI and perhaps maybe give him a closing word or two.
Yes, thank you. And thank you everybody for your active participation. I will remind you that this webinar and others that we've had in this series, and then the first series focused on COVID-19 and the rights of Indigenous peoples are if they're not posted now, they will be posted very soon on the IITC website in the link to the webinars. And since the first series, and we've had, I think we had 10 webinars in that series and 8 in this one, looking ahead to life after COVID. By request of Indigenous peoples, we've had a request to have the next webinar series that we plan to begin in November sometime, focusing on specific skill sharing based on traditional knowledge and practices, beginning number one with traditional fire prevention, forest fire and wildfire prevention techniques from, we have Australia, California, Canada, and Alaska so far. Planting, seed sharing, seed preserving, water preservation, dry land irrigation techniques, those kinds of very practical skills that Indigenous peoples are really thinking about now, as the Special Rapporteur referred to, you know, as we look at our food security, our food independence, food sovereignty, and our all-round general health and resiliency. So we'll let you know when all those start to happen. And just a final word from me, the report of the Special Rapporteur to the General Assembly, which will be presented, he said, this week. You had the preview here, is already posted on the IITC website, and I'm sure also on the site of the Special Rapporteur for the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pancho for any final words he would like to leave us with today. And again, thank you for everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. That's Zoom, not us. Anyway, Pancho, please take the last floor.
Muchas gracias, Andrea. Yo lo único que puedo decirles a ustedes es
Thank you very much, Andrea.
agradecerles
The only
a cada
remaining
una y a
thing
cada
to
uno
say
de
to
los
all of you is thank
miembros de las
you all.
organizaciones de los
Thanks
pueblos
to
indígenas
all of you, each and every one of you,
que
as members
respondieron al
of
cuestionario.
indigenous organizations
Espero
who
que de esa
responded
misma
to the
forma como
questionnaire and the
participaron en
survey
este estudio,
to
puedan participar
participate in this
acompañándome
study.
en todo el
This is
proceso
the
de mi
way that
mandato.
you participate,
Es la
and
única
I
forma
invite you to
que
continue to do
podemos
so, to
asegurar
accompany
que
me
yo pueda
throughout my
reflejar
mandate.
lo que
This is the
ustedes
only way
están
that I can
tratando
truly
de
reflect what
comunicarle a Naciones
you are
Unidas y a
trying
los
to
estados.
communicate
Con
to
esto
the
no quiero
United
decir de
Nations and to
que
the
voy
states.
a
So
tomar
I
el
just
lado
want to say that
de las organizaciones indígenas, sino que yo lo que
I
tengo que
will
hacer es defender los derechos que
what I
están
must do is not take the
estipulados en
side of
la
indigenous
Declaración de Derechos de los
organizations, but
Pueblos
to defend
Indígenas.
the rights of indigenous
El
peoples
mandato no me
enshrined
deja
in the
tomar
declaration.
un lado ni
My
otro.
mandate does not
Sin
allow me to
embargo,
take one side
soy
or the
Maya
other.
Cachiquel.
But
Muchas gracias.
however, I am Maya Cachiquel myself. So thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much. It's been a real honor to be a part of this program again, and just to let Chris Honani know that we can shut down the webinar now. We can end now. Thank you very much.